Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a huge topic, one that's foundational to understanding how we become who we are.
We really are. We're looking at the cognitive revolution of adolescence.
Exactly. We're going to be doing a deep analysis of that profound cognitive shift that happens, roughly between the ages of 11 and 18.
And this is so much more than just, the physical changes of puberty.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a transition that fundamentally rewires how a person sees the world. It's the move from thinking about tangible reality to abstract possibility.
And it's how they develop a sense of self that's so intense it could, power entire fictional narratives about their own life.
That's a great way to put it.
So our mission today, and this is all based on the specialized source material you shared with us, is to go way beyond the typical surface-level observations of teenage behavior.
Right.
We are going to analyze the science of what's called formal operational thought, the deep-seated role of egocentrism, and the underlying brain science that dictates everything.
Everything from risk-taking to how they perform in the classroom. The material gives us this really sophisticated framework for understanding this stage.
So we'll be breaking down the specific cognitive tools adolescents get, and maybe most importantly, how the timing mismatch.
The asynchronous development.
Yes, exactly. The asynchronous development of the emotional limbic system versus the rational prefrontal cortex. How that creates this really unique and, let's be honest, often confusing phase of life.
It really is the key.
So the big question we're tackling is, I think, fundamental. How does the mind actually make that leap from being concrete and childlike, only able to process what's right in front of it?
To an abstract, logically capable adult mind.
And why does this massive cognitive upgrade come packaged with such unique, sometimes high-stakes emotional and behavioral patterns?
It's a paradox, isn't it?
It is. So let's unpack this. I think we should start with what happens when that young mind turns its focus inward and creates what you call the adolescent bubble.
A perfect place to start. So the time frame for this seismic cognitive transition, the shift from the concrete mind to abstract logic, is generally understood to be between 11 and 18 years.
And it's important to stress, this is not a switch that slips overnight. Right?
Yeah, not at all. It's a long, uneven road. Some abilities come online much earlier than others.
And the sources are really clear that this transformation isn't purely biological. It's not just a timer going off in the brain.
No, it's a multi-layered process. It's driven by brain maturation, yes, but it's equally driven by things like intense conversations, by formal schooling, which demands new ways of thinking.
Right. It forces them to think abstractly.
It does. And they're also facing complex moral challenges for the first time, and maybe most critically, they're getting more independence from their environment.
So the environment is actually a catalyst for this.
You can think of the environment as providing the necessary friction to activate these dormant cognitive capacities. When you give an adolescent independence, you force them to make decisions.
Decisions that require them to think about what if.
Exactly. What if I do this? What might happen then? That hypothetical thought feeds the engine of development.
Okay, so with all this new cognitive power turning on, the most immediate thing we see is this intense focus on the self. This is where the imaginary audience comes in.
It is. The imaginary audience is the most immediate and recognizable expression of this shift.
And it's that profound feeling of always being watched, right? Scrutinized, basically feeling like you're on stage all the time.
Yeah.
I think everyone listening can probably recall this from their own teenage years.
Oh, absolutely. But it's more than just simple self-consciousness. The detailed explanation in the sources shows this involves adolescents thinking intensely about themselves and, crucially, what other people think of them.
Okay.
But here's the cognitive exaggeration that defines it. They project their own intense self-scrutiny onto everyone else. They genuinely believe they are much more unique, much more special, and either far more admired or far more disliked than they actually are.
So if they stumble in the hallway, it's not just an oops moment.
No. In their mind, they genuinely believe that 30 other students saw it, replayed that stumble in their minds, and are now discussing it at length.
Their internal monologue becomes everyone else's external judgment.
That's it exactly. And this is a critical point. It leads them to interpret every subtle cue, a glance, a whispered comment, a chuckle from across the room as a personal judgment against them.
Wow.
Everything gets filtered through this hypersensitive lens of how does this relate to my status, to my appearance, to my perceived flaws?
That sounds exhausting, that massive cognitive load of just constant social processing. There's no wonder adolescence can be so draining.
It's a huge energy drain. And this intense, magnified self-perception, it doesn't just stop with the imaginary audience. It actually fuels what the research calls the fables of the self.
Okay, the fables of the self. There are two of them, right? Let's break down the first one, the personal fable.
The personal fable is the deep-seated belief that one's own thoughts, feelings, or experiences are utterly, completely unique.
More unique than anyone else's in the history of the world.
Precisely. The sources define it as the conviction that one's situation is either more wonderfully perfect or more hideously awful than anyone else's. They believe, truly, that no one else could possibly understand the depth of their first heartbreak.
Or the specific nuance of their existential loneliness, or the
Yeah.
incredible heights of their joy and their, artistic vision.
Yes, it's the you just don't understand feeling, but elevated to a core belief system.
That sense of unique emotional isolation is so powerful. But it's also a kind of psychological defense, isn't it? If you see yourself as a hero or a victim in a completely unique narrative, that makes you special.
It does.
And that might shield you from the sort of mundane pain of just trying to fit in.
That's the psychological function of it,
Yeah.
yes. And when that sense of exceptionalism gets applied to risk,
Yeah.
that's when we move into the second fable.
The invincibility fable.
Right. This is the egocentric conviction that the individual cannot be overcome or even harmed by anything that might defeat a normal mortal.
And this is the cognitive engine that drives so much of the high-risk behavior we associate with teenagers, isn't it?
It is. It manifests in these rationalizations like, yes, the accident rate for new drivers is high, but that only happens to bad drivers, and I'm an exceptional driver.
Or drug abuse is a problem for people who don't have my level of control.
Exactly. Or the consequences of unprotected sex won't apply to me because my life is just different. It's a powerful sense of psychological immunity from common consequences.
Okay, before we move on, we have to define one more term here because it's sort of the engine keeping all of this running. Rumination.
Yes, rumination is key. It's defined as thinking obsessively about something, a past experience, a social failure, a fantasy, to the point that it just captures the mind completely.
It makes practical action difficult.
Very difficult. It's the inability to switch cognitive tracks. So if the imaginary audience tells them they were judged for something they said in class,
Rumination is what forces them to replay that moment over and over again for hours.
endlessly, they rerun that social interaction, perfecting the narrative of their own perceived victimhood, or maybe their misunderstood genius.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because the sources point out this apparent paradox, a contrast between older research and what we're learning now about egocentrism.
Mm-hmm.
The traditional view saw the invincibility fable as purely a driver of recklessness, just a bad thing.
That's right. For decades, that was the consensus. But the sources present a very nuanced contemporary shift in thinking.
What's the new perspective?
Current research proposes that this specialized egocentrism, specifically the unique narrative of the personal fable, may actually be protective in many situations.
Protective. So we're saying that while it can fuel recklessness in some areas, like substance abuse or dangerous driving, the underlying belief that I'm special might actually foster resilience.
That is the compelling hypothesis. Researchers are finding that adolescents who score high on feeling psychologically invincible, they actually tend to be more resilient in the face of academic or social setbacks.
That's fascinating. So if you believe your destiny is unique, that your thoughts and feelings are so profound that no one else could possibly get it.
You're less likely to be completely derailed by a temporary failure. A bad grade or a social rejection might crush someone with a less fortified ego, but for them, it's just a plot point in their grand, unique story.
It's the belief that they are fundamentally built differently, which allows them to bounce back faster. Okay, but we have to address the critique here. If the invincibility fable fuels resilience, how do the sources reconcile that positive outcome with the very real, very dangerous consequences of high-risk behaviors?
That is the central paradox, and it's what researchers are really digging into now. The current thinking suggests that the psychological sense of mastery, the resilience part, is distinct from the behavioral manifestation of poor impulse control.
So they're not the same thing, even if they often appear together.
Exactly. They're often correlated, but they're not perfectly linked. The resilience, which is driven by the personal fable, is about internal recovery from failure. The risk-taking, driven by the invincibility fable, is about underestimating external danger.
So the challenge for healthy development is to maintain that protective sense of self-belief while also acquiring the cognitive tools to rationally assess external risks.
You've hit the nail on the head. The challenge is keeping the resilience while developing the logic.
So to put it another way, the egocentrism provides the armor, but the formal logic, which we're about to get into, provides the map.
A perfect analogy. Without the map, that armored car still drives right off a cliff.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for our next section. The map you just referred to is that massive shift out of the concrete mindset into abstract thought. And for that, we have to talk about Jean Piaget.
We do. We are talking about Piaget's fourth and final stage of cognitive development, formal operational thought.
This is the gold standard for adult cognition, right? It's characterized by systematic, scientific logic and, crucially, the ability to think about abstract, non-physical ideas.
It represents the complete detachment of thought from physical reality. Think about it this way. A primary school student, a concrete, operational thinker, can only grasp concepts if they can physically manipulate them or visualize them in a tangible way.
So for them, justice might mean something concrete, like everyone getting the same number of cookies.
Exactly, taking turns. But an adolescent in the formal operational stage can grapple with justice as a purely hypothetical, moral, and systemic concept. They can debate fairness, equity, and rights without needing a physical example.
The moment a teenager can look at a problem and hypothesize multiple outcomes, even outcomes that defy current reality, they've reached this stage. This is hypothetical thought.
Yes. It's the ability to engage in reasoning that uses propositions and possibilities that may not reflect reality. They can imagine perfect societies, they can analyze scientific theories that haven't been proven, or engage with philosophical paradoxes.
It's a true transformation of perception. It allows them to systematically test out possibilities in their mind before they act.
It does. And this capacity to play out these complex, multi-layered what-if scenarios is built on mastering the two central pillars of reasoning.
Deductive and inductive reasoning. And understanding the difference here is so important for seeing the cognitive leap they're making.
It's everything.
Okay, let's start with deductive reasoning. This is often called top-down reasoning, and it's the real hallmark of formal operational thought.
Deductive reasoning starts from a general statement, a known premise, or an established principle, that's the top, and then it uses rigorous logical steps to figure out the specifics, to deduce them.
It's a very rule-governed way of thinking.
It is. The classic example is the syllogism. If the general rule is all mammals have hair, and the specific subject is a cat is a mammal,
then the inevitable deductive conclusion is the cat have hair.
right. And they don't need to actually see the cat to know the conclusion is true as long as the initial premise holds.
So this ability to accept a premise as true in principle, even if it seems totally unreal or abstract, and just follow the logic to its inevitable conclusion, that's the mark of high-level logical thought.
It is, and it's essential for advanced mathematics, for analyzing complex legal structures, or for understanding political theory.
Okay, now let's contrast that with the other pillar, inductive reasoning, or bottom-up reasoning.
Inductive reasoning is the opposite. It starts from one or more specific experiences or facts, that's the bottom, and uses those specifics to reach a general, probable conclusion.
So it's based on observation and probability, not logical certainty.
Exactly. This is considered less cognitively advanced than deduction, but it's still absolutely essential for everyday life and for scientific discovery.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. If every time a teenager texts their friend, that friend replies within 5 minutes, they use induction to form a general conclusion. My friend is a fast replier. They are relying on a collection of specific data points to form a generalization.
And this really highlights that critical cognitive shift from childhood. Children, the concrete operational thinkers, they rely almost completely on inductive reasoning.
They do. A child's world is built on what they see and what they're told. They draw conclusions based solely on their own limited experiences.
So a child sees 10 swans, and all of them are white. They induce that all swans must be white.
Yes. Their logic is bound to the sensory input they've received. An adolescent, however, can be told the principle, there are black swans in Australia, accept it hypothetically, and deduce that their own experience is not universal.
So they transition to being able to think deductively from the top down. And that's what lets them engage with these highly abstract subjects where the premises might not have any physical reality to ground them.
Right, and what's fascinating here is the interplay between the two. The sources note that the adolescent's mind, which is fresh with this new abstract capacity, is actually very good at rationalizing. They're great at finding inductive evidence to support a belief they already hold.
Ah, so they can use it to confirm their own biases.
Very easily. They can search for data points that support their emotionally driven conclusion. But the true leap to formal operational thought is deduction, because it requires you to start with the principle itself and see if the evidence fits that rule, rather than just gathering evidence until a convenient rule emerges.
So if they're given a principle they don't like, say a strict school rule, their nimble inductive mind can try to poke holes in it by pointing to specific instances where it doesn't seem fair.
But deductive reasoning forces them to accept the structural truth of the rule itself and see the consequences that flow from it. That cognitive challenge is a powerful driver of their intellectual development across those years.
Okay, so they acquire this amazing new tool for abstract and deductive thought. But that doesn't mean they're using it all the time.
Not even close. In fact, most decision-making, even for adults, relies on a much faster system. And this brings us directly to the concept of dual processing.
Dual processing. So we all operate with these two fundamental modes of thinking.
We do. Intuitive and analytic.
Let's define those clearly, because they really represent the central conflict of the teenage mind. So, intuitive thought. That's thought arising from an emotion, a gut feeling, a hunch.
Right. It's fast, it requires very little effort, and it's heavily influenced by past experiences, cultural assumptions, and whatever emotional landscape you're in at that moment.
And then there's analytic thought. This is the slow, systematic, formal, logical approach.
This is the one that results from deep analysis. It involves carefully and systematically ranking pros and cons, evaluating risks and consequences, and relying heavily on logic, rationality, and that newly acquired formal operational skill set we just talked about.
So the key dynamic in adolescence is this struggle to balance these two competing systems.
It's a constant tug of war.
And the sources state plainly that rational, analytic judgment is exceptionally difficult when those egocentric emotions are dominating. If the imaginary audience is screaming at you that everyone is judging your outfit,
Your intuitive, fear-based thought often overrides the slow, laborious process of analysis. There's no time to think logically. No one cares about my shoes. The gut feeling of shame takes over.
and the sources also emphasize the role of experience here.
Yes. Experience in making complex decisions actually facilitates the more accurate and efficient use of analysis. A younger adolescent who just lacks that deep library of experiential consequences often defaults to the emotionally satisfying, immediate, intuitive route.
They just haven't had enough practice forcing the prefrontal cortex to win the argument.
That's a perfect way to put it. The developmental goal, which continues well into the early 20s, is to gradually learn how to balance that formal analytic thinking with the quick, emotional, experiential thinking. Because intuitive decisions, while fast, can be fatally flawed.
Especially when the stakes are high.
Right. And this tension, this tug of war between the logical and the emotional, it isn't just a psychological idea, it is physically rooted in the dual processing of the brain structure.
The anatomical timing mismatch. This is where the neurodevelopmental science comes in.
It is. This explains so much of adolescent behavior.
So tell us about this structural tension and the timing mismatch. What's actually happening inside the skull?
Okay, so you have the limbic system. This is the evolutionarily older part of the brain that governs emotions, memory, and instinctual survival-based behaviors.
The emotional core.
The emotional core. Structures like the amygdala, which handles emotional response, and the nucleus accumbens, which is central to the reward pathway. They are strongly activated by the surge of sex hormones during puberty. They are fully operational and sending powerful signals right away.
So the emotional accelerator is pressed hard to the floor.
It is floored. But the brakes, that's the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
Which is responsible for executive function, planning, systematic analysis, and crucial impulse control.
Exactly. And the PFC matures much, much more gradually. This maturation involves intensive pruning of synapses and, critically, this slow process called myelination, which speeds up signal transmission.
And then that process continues for years.
It continues well into the mid-20s. So the sources confirm that the adolescent brain simply gives fewer signals of caution or inhibition compared to an adult brain because the PFC is literally still under construction. The wiring isn't fully insulated yet.
Let's get a bit more technical here, because I know you're interested in the science. What's the role of neurotransmitters like dopamine in this reward pathway during this time?
That is a crucial detail. The subcortical regions that are involved in sensation seeking, specifically those that are rich in dopamine receptors, they develop rapidly after puberty.
So they become hyperresponsive.
Hyperresponsive. This dopamine pathway, which signals pleasure and reward, is amplified. The chemical reward they get from a novel, exciting, or risky situation is chemically stronger than it would be for a child or an adult.
which provides a powerful neurological fuel for risk-taking.
A very powerful fuel. And this helps us understand a really critical distinction: sensation seeking versus impulsivity.
Right. We often use those terms interchangeably to describe teenagers, but the source material, specifically citing the Look Before You Leap study, shows they are two distinct things with separate trajectories.
That study provided really valuable, differentiated data. The general trends it found were a major burst of sensation seeking right around puberty, which was then followed by a slow decline as the adolescent aged.
Okay. And what about impulsivity?
Impulsivity also showed a slow decline over the years of adolescence. But here's the critical, counterintuitive finding. The decline in sensation seeking did not correlate with the decline in impulsivity.
So they're not linked. That is a game changer for understanding how to manage adolescent risk. If they don't correlate, it means they're driven by different underlying systems.
They absolutely are. Sensation seeking is the motivational drive for novel, intense experiences. It's fueled by those rapidly developing dopamine-rich subcortical regions. It's the want for excitement.
And impulsivity.
Impulsivity, conversely, is the lack of control. It's the failure of the gradually maturing prefrontal cortex to check, inhibit, or delay an action. It's the inability to stop oneself.
So you can have a highly sensation-seeking adolescent who, maybe because of strong cognitive training or environmental supports, has actually developed decent impulse control. They might plan their risks carefully.
Yes. Like a skilled rock climber. High sensation seeking, low impulsivity.
Or you could have an adolescent who isn't necessarily seeking extreme thrills, but just acts impulsively because their PFC is lagging developmentally.
That's precisely the implication. It means that any interventions can't just treat risk-taking as a single monolithic problem.
You have to target the right system.
You do. If you want to reduce danger, you need to focus on enhancing PFC development to improve impulse control, regardless of the person's innate motivation for excitement. If you want to understand why they choose an activity, you look at sensation seeking.
So they're distinct behavioral and neurological targets. The structural timing mismatch, the early peaking reward system, and the late peaking control system is truly the engine of the risk-taking phase.
That's the whole story right there.
Okay, so this entire cognitive transformation, the shift to abstract logic, the battle between intuition and analysis, it all plays out most dramatically inside the structured environment of secondary education.
This is really where the rubber hits the road. Secondary education, which is defined as the period after primary school and before college, so typically from about age 12 to 18.
And within that, the sources define middle school as that crucial transitional phase, usually grades 5 or 6 through grade 8.
A very turbulent time, cognitively and socially.
And the key challenge in high school centers on the expectations around formal thought. The major issue noted in the source material, particularly for college-bound students, is this dangerous assumption that many educators make.
The assumption is that these students have simply mastered formal thinking by virtue of turning 14 or 15.
So they stop teaching how to do it.
Exactly. They stop teaching the foundational cognitive strategies. They just expect students to apply complex formal logic to subjects like chemistry or philosophy or economics without any explicit instruction on the method itself.
And this problem is compounded by the heavy reliance on high-stakes tests. These are the evaluations that are critical for determining graduation or promotion.
And the sources raise a fundamental question. Do these tests, in their current form, actually measure the successful acquisition of formal operational thought? Or do they just measure memorization?
That question led to the development of an international effort to try and measure practical applied cognition, and that's the PISA.
Right. The Program for International Student Assessment.
PISA is a crucial, high-profile benchmark. It's an international test taken by 15-year-olds in over 50 nations, and it's specifically designed to measure problem-solving and cognition in daily life.
It's about the application of knowledge, not just memory recall.
And the data point that's relevant for U.S. performance is pretty telling. Overall, U.S. students performed worse on PISA's application measures than they did on other international tests, like PRLS for literacy or TIMSS for math and science facts.
What that suggests is that while American students might be effective at information retention, that sort of inductive, fact-based learning, they struggle comparatively when they're asked to apply complex deductive problem-solving skills in new practical situations.
Which suggests the disconnect between what our schools are often forced to teach and what high-level formal operational thought actually demands. So, what's the blueprint for success? The sources highlight several key correlates that contribute to high PISA achievement.
The success is holistic. It's not isolated to a single school or one great teacher. High achievement happens where there's a shared cultural belief that all stakeholders, parents, teachers, students, the government value education.
Okay.
It's also where individualized learning approaches are consistently used and where academic standards are high and clear across the entire system.
Let's elaborate on what valuing teachers and administrators means in practice in these high-performing systems. It can't just mean a thank you card during Teacher Appreciation Week.
No, not at all. In systems that excel, like those often cited in Scandinavia or parts of Asia, valuing educators means providing them with significant autonomy in the classroom. It means requiring advanced degrees, offering competitive compensation, and investing heavily in ongoing professional development.
So it treats teaching as a high-skill, respected profession.
It communicates that the intellectual rigor of teaching how to think deductively is paramount. And furthermore, learning is prioritized across the whole system, so resources, time, and community focus are all aligned toward cognitive development.
That paints a picture of a real systemic commitment, not just individual heroics from teachers. But let's circle back to the core challenge of high-stakes testing, especially in systems that rely so heavily on them. What are the major problems with these tests?
The core complaint, which resonates with both educators and, I think, our audience, is that these exit tests often force teachers into a very constrained instructional role.
They have to teach to the test.
They have to. They end up preparing students to be good test takers who know a lot of facts, rather than teaching the essential 21st century skills that formal operational thought is all about.
And what are those critical skills that get sidelined because of this intense focus on testing?
They are precisely the skills that rely on abstract, deductive reasoning. The ability to work effectively with others in complex team environments, analyzing open-ended problems where the solution isn't predetermined.
Synthesizing facts from different fields?
Yes, and identifying misinformation or fake news, a critical application of deduction in the digital age, and imagining novel, creative solutions to existing challenges.
None of which can be easily graded on a multiple-choice bubble sheet.
Not at all. Standardized, fact-based tests actively discourage teaching these sophisticated skills. So the education system, in trying to measure accountability, sometimes inadvertently punishes the development of the very thinking skills the adolescent brain is just becoming ready to acquire.
That's a profound and troubling irony.
It is. The source material notes the static nature of some of these long-standing tests, confirming that SAT and ACT scores haven't really risen or fallen significantly in recent years.
And that stagnation, coupled with a recognition that these tests may not measure what really matters, is why so many colleges and universities have moved away from requiring them for admission.
Exactly. They're shifting focus toward markers of analytical capability and practical problem solving demonstrated in other ways.
Okay, so moving from the structure of the education system itself, we have to discuss how the adolescent student internally interacts with all these challenges. And a pivotal aspect of success in secondary school is student engagement.
It's absolutely central.
And yet, this period where students are gaining these remarkable new cognitive tools is often where we see the greatest levels of disengagement. It's a huge contradiction.
It is. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of their internal development, the sources suggest that puberty itself may contribute to disengagement.
How so?
Well, the intense internal focus of egocentrism, that imaginary audience, the constant social anxiety, plus the overwhelming hormonal shifts, and the necessary reprioritization of social status over academic effort. All of that can pull an adolescent's energy and attention away from the classroom.
It's the psychological equivalent of a system overload. Their internal processing is so intense that there's just no bandwidth left for calculus.
That's a great way of looking at it. And the worst consequence of that sustained disengagement is a form of psychological withdrawal that leads to students becoming what the sources call status dropouts.
Status dropouts.
Yes. They are physically present in the classroom, but they are mentally and emotionally checked out. They've given up on the goal of intellectual engagement long before they might ever physically leave the school.
Now, on the flip side, when an adolescent is engaged, their new cognitive abilities, the abstract, analytic, hypothetical thought, allow them to fully respond to challenging high school curriculum. And this engagement is powerfully mediated by their own internal sense of potential, their mindset.
We're talking about Carol Dweck's work here, which is just central to understanding how adolescents approach failure and challenge.
So with a growth mindset, students believe their intelligence and abilities can be developed through effort and dedication,
Right. And as a result, they actively seek out challenges. They see failure not as a final judgment, but as a temporary setback and a learning opportunity.
which aligns perfectly with that psychological resilience that can be fueled by the personal fable we talked about earlier.
It does. They feed each other. But on the destructive side, you have students with a fixed mindset.
They believe their abilities are static, set in stone.
Yes. And so they become focused entirely on social comparison, on ranking themselves among their peers, and on avoiding anything that might expose a perceived deficiency. The analytical risk of being wrong is just too high for them, so they stick to what they know.
Which completely stifles that formal operational drive to explore the hypothetical.
It shuts it down, and this mindset issue doesn't only apply to the students. The sources are very clear about the danger of the teacher-fixed mindset.
This is when educators attribute a student's low performance not to a failure of curriculum or support strategies, but to the student's inherent fixed characteristics.
Exactly. They blame the student's personality, their community, their family, or their presumed low intelligence. It externalizes the problem and creates this fatalistic environment in the classroom.
Which undermines any chance of that student ever adopting a growth mindset, because the authority figure in the room has already declared the outcome is fixed.
It can be devastating. And the environment students navigate also involves these complex external social pressures, which leads us directly to the critical concept of stereotype threat.
A mechanism that is deeply influenced by the adolescent's heightened self-consciousness.
It's a vital concept that links directly back to that egocentrism we started with. Stereotype threat is defined as the thought a person has that their appearance or their behavior will be misread or misinterpreted to confirm another person's oversimplified, prejudiced attitudes about their social group.
So it's the constant, exhausting mental labor of self-monitoring to avoid confirming a negative expectation. Let's explore the mechanism here,
Yeah.
because for our audience, the cognitive cost is the most relevant detail.
Okay, so if we connect this back to the imaginary audience, that hypersensitive radar for external judgment, we can see why adolescents are uniquely vulnerable to this.
The threat feels more intense for them.
Much more intense. And the stress generated by anticipating bias causes a physiological stress response. It elevates cortisol levels. But critically, this self-monitoring and stress response drains the cognitive resources that are required for high-level analytic thinking.
So when a student is experiencing stereotype threat, their limited working memory, that mental scratch pad they need to hold and manipulate information for deductive problem solving, is partially occupied by anxiety.
And by self-monitoring. The resources that are needed for formal operational thought are essentially siphoned off to manage the threat.
They're being used for emotional self-defense instead of for academics.
That's right. The sources provide a powerful example. If students from a particular group anticipate racial bias, they may perceive a totally neutral teacher behavior like a request to stay after class to clarify an assignment as inherently disrespectful or judgmental.
Even if the teacher intended no disrespect at all.
It doesn't matter. That internal thought process, the anticipation of bias, affects their hormones, their emotions, and ultimately their capacity for high-level thinking in that moment.
This means that if a high school teacher, who's already assuming their students have mastered formal thinking, combines high expectations with general, non-supportive instruction,
That combination of high cognitive demand and perceived social bias can create a perfect storm.
the stereotype threat then becomes a direct barrier to a student's ability to use their newly acquired formal operational skills effectively.
The environment either fosters or inhibits the use of that sophisticated new logic. If the internal resources are being spent managing stereotype threat or fixed mindset anxieties, the capacity for slow, analytic, deductive thought is severely diminished.
The adolescent mind is powerful, but it's also fragile and highly responsive to perceived judgment.
A vulnerability that stems directly from that early egocentrism.
What an extensive and I think really necessary deep dive into the architecture of the adolescent mind. We've established that this intense cognitive journey from 11 to 18 is driven by both psychological forces and measurable neurological changes.
We have. We charted the foundational impact of egocentrism, which gives rise to the hypersensitivity of the imaginary audience and that protective but risky psychological shield of the fables of the self.
And then we confirmed that the acquisition of abstract logic, Piaget's formal operational thought, is really defined by the ability to employ top-down deductive reasoning.
And we dissected that fundamental tension within the brain itself. The immediate amplified activation of the limbic system driving intuition and sensation seeking, which is battling the slow, gradual maturation of the prefrontal cortex, the center for analysis and impulse control.
And we confirm that sensation-seeking and impulsivity are separate phenomena. They have to be addressed distinctly.
Finally, we analyzed how all these shifts collide with the educational environment, where the assumption of formal thinking can be detrimental, and where systemic issues like standardized testing and psychological barriers like stereotype threat can actively drain the cognitive capacity needed for success.
I think the major takeaway here is the importance of understanding the precise timing and the nature of these complex shifts when we design learning environments or even just when we evaluate adolescent behavior.
Absolutely. Maturity in this context is ultimately about finding that functional balance. It's that moment where the powerful emotional drive of intuition is consistently tempered and guided by systematic analysis and formal logic.
That balance is indeed the developmental goal. And our source material offered one final, highly provocative thought that I think brings us full circle.
The idea that the feeling of invincibility, the core of the personal fable, can actually foster profound psychological resilience.
Right. So considering the gradual maturation of the prefrontal cortex, which we know continues well into early adulthood, how might we leverage that early adolescent feeling of unique resilience safely? How do we channel that powerful I am special energy toward positive endeavors?
Recognizing that impulse control is still years away from full development, we have to figure out how to establish environments and structures that effectively support a resilient young person without relying on their fully developed logic,
So how do we harness the I can conquer the world motivational energy?
while simultaneously teaching the but I need to look at the immediate consequences first logic. That is the ultimate crucial challenge of guiding the adolescent mind through its greatest cognitive transformation.
A profound question to take with you. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.